Hello, and welcome back to Analyze Asia, a podcast dedicated to dissecting the pulse of business, media, and technology in Asia. I'm your host, Carol, and this is our last episode of 2020. And what a year it has been. But as per Analyze Asia traditions, we've invited our longtime friend, Shai Oster, the Asia Bureau Chief of the Information, to come onto the show to do our annual year-end rundown with us. First of all, welcome back, Shai.
Hi, thanks for having me back.
The last time we spoke, it was pretty much a year ago. And well, who would have thought that 2020 would turn out like this? A global pandemic was definitely not on anyone's predictions. So since your last appearance on the show, what have you been up to?
Running away from disease. We made it to New York just before the wave hit there and then made it back to Hong Kong. And we've been hunkered down here, keeping busy chasing headlines ever since. We all look like dental hygienists here in Hong Kong with our masks, learning to live a different way, washing our hands so much that they crack and turn bloody. But, looking forward to getting vaccinated sometime in the next year. One thing I got to say for Hong Kong's government is they seem to have been on top of securing supplies for everyone. So touch wood, or fake wood-like product that I'm sitting next to. I hope that 2021's a little brighter. I got to say, though, it was interesting is that despite the absolute bleep of last year, censoring myself, it was interesting to learn how to work remotely. I'm sure everyone went through that experience of how to juggle trying to stay in touch with your fellow coworkers while trying not to murder your family members at the same time. These were interesting challenges. But I think in some ways, we all learned that we don't necessarily need to be in an office, and learned a lot about how the future is definitely going to be changed by the way we, in so many of aspects of our lives.
That's right. We are recording our episode remotely right now, but we've been doing that for a while now, so we're a bit ahead of the game. Now, first, before we start talking about what has happened in 2020, do you still remember what kind of predictions you made at the end of the year in 2019 about 2020?
I didn't. My brain, I have such short-term memory loss that but luckily you guys gave me a bit of a heads up. And I was surprised that some of my predictions seemed to have been kind of okay. Of course, no one, as you said, no one predicted global pandemic that will come. And if you did predict a global pandemic, I don't think you would have said, yeah, and China will win. America will just fall on its face. But what's interesting is that China did have, I've talked about China's economy, and it has in fact been an incredibly challenging year for China, but also one that really showed a surprising resilience and underlying resilience in the Chinese economy. I would not have guessed that it would recover as quickly and as robustly as it has, to be frank. But yes, I was right on the China's economy. And then I also thought that TikTok would retreat from the US, which it still is in the US, to be frank. So that's directionally right, although how it played out isn't quite the way I would have thought. But there's definitely a renewed focus on China within ByteDance and its other products like Lark, the big push into e-commerce. I said they'd be making a bigger push into India. Would not have predicted that India is dead to them. Although, unlike Alibaba, ByteDance hasn't fired people, so I think they're still playing a long game in India. In Africa, I haven't really seen much of any action there. I think Africa is a challenging market, although there are plenty of tech entrepreneurs doing well there. But I don't think, as far as I know, ByteDance is one of them. The shift of money to other markets, yes and no. In the beginning, I think in the first half of the year, that was some sentiment in that direction, and then quickly, what happened is that it's diversifying. I think it's maybe not as concentrated in China, but definitely, what you're seeing is that, for example, the company Sea, the gaming and e-commerce company out of Southeast Asia, that's now nearly $100 billion company, formerly Garena. That's shown that Southeast Asia is a really compelling market, right? You can see now that there's an exit. There's a viable exit. You may not be able to IPO at $100 billion, but you got a buyer. And so definitely we're seeing flows of money towards Southeast Asia, and the incredible action with Geo and Reliance Industries raising billions of dollars for its big push has shown also that there is real money to be made in India. That said, we've also seen record new funds being raised in China. Now, there's a concentration of, it's not like it was a couple of years ago where anybody could raise $100 million fund just by hanging out a shingle. But Jack Ma, Yun Fund has raised a couple billion. Who else? China Renaissance is raising combined 2.5 billion equivalent, split into a US dollar fund and a renminbi fund. Their biggest, Qiming, is again raising. GGV is raising an enormous fund. So how would I score myself on that one? I guess 60%? I don't know. You tell me. What do you think?
I think you definitely pass if we were to grade your predictions from 2019.
All right.
Yeah. I mean, no one could have. I think you received a really good score, given that it has been an extremely challenging paper, for the year 2020 because of this curveball of the pandemic. And you talked about U.S.-China tension as well, about how, there likely is going to be some kind of trade war, which I think is kind of we're going through. Yeah, we're, going through that right now and exacerbated by the pandemic and everything. So yeah, I think you did pretty well.
It's like my college organic chemistry. Luckily I was graded on a curve, so I didn't fail.
Now, let's cover some of the events that happened this year. So 2020 events that shook China and SoftBank. So we mentioned the China-US tensions, which will have exacerbated and percolated to other regions as well. You mentioned, India. As our listeners probably know, India banned about 47 apps, including WeChat, TikToks, and many of these Chinese apps. And then also Australia and the US banned WeChat. So let's go to India first. Given that the major unicorns are invested by Chinese tech giants, for example, Paytm has investments from Alibaba, and then there are the rise of local giants such as Reliance Jewel, as you talked about, which is backed by a strong US consortium like Facebook, Google, Silver Lake, etc. What do you think some of the challenges are moving ahead for Chinese companies like Xiaomi, which is dominant in India?
Sure. No, it's interesting. So Alibaba is toast in India. We actually wrote a story. My colleague Juro Asawa did a deep dive into Alibaba's problems. And it turns out that Alibaba was kind of stumbling even before there was that deadly border skirmish between Chinese and Indian troops that triggered the ban. So Alibaba was already kind of not doing such a great job. It had tried several times to strike alliances with these very powerful Indian tycoons, including Reliance. So it struck out with Reliance. It actually had a deal with Tata, but then days later that the chairman that they struck the deal with was ousted in a boardroom coup. So that fell apart, and then they tried with a few others. And all these people that they tried to strike deals with ended up becoming tech giants in their own right. India, while compared to China, it's a poor market, right? It does not have the per capita income, and China now has an enormous, not only e-commerce, but also the advertising industry, right? Like, remember, Alibaba, I think about half of its revenue is from advertising. So it's a very rich market. Whereas if you look at India's total advertising market is about as big as all of Southeast Asia. Couple billion. It's nothing. But everybody looks to India and says, oh, okay, this looks like China 20 years ago. Young population, rising incomes, and everyone's betting that 10 years from now it'll pay a dividend. So that's why people are willing to make these long bets. But Alibaba has just retreated. But that was from even before the political poop storm hit, they were already stumbling. Tencent, interestingly, is still playing its game. It's still making its investing strategy is less like a strategic investor such as Alibaba and more like a financial investor. So it takes substantial but minority stakes in, I think, Swiggy. Who is it back? Off the top of my head, I can't remember. But they're still there and haven't, because, yes, WeChat's banned, but so what, right? WeChat is not an international app. It's a domestic app. PUBG became a problem, so that matters. But still, in terms of their presence as an investor, they're still there. They're still haven't had the same blowback. Companies that have been decimated would be somebody doing like a straight cross-border e-commerce play, like a Club Factory. They're banned and they're dead in the water. Now, what's up with a company like Xiaomi? So Xiaomi, despite their marketing, is a hardware company. Their software ecosystem, I think, exists kind of in China, but it doesn't really translate anywhere else. On the rest of the world, they're a really good spec, cheap Android phone. And I think it's interesting to note is they haven't been hit yet. And I don't think they will be because it doesn't pose the same threat. I think also they're subject to the same requirements that Apple and others are in terms of local production. So that means that you already have like boots on the ground, factories, people who are going to lobby on your behalf. There's Indian workers that you're employing. And so just kind of like how Apple in China employs directly like 1 million plus, you can't kick out Apple because that's a lot of unemployed Chinese. The same thing, I think Xiaomi now has such a presence. You can kick out Xiaomi because not only is there production there, but there's a whole, least favorite word, but I'll use it, ecosystem of the retailers, the supply chain. Like there's a lot of people who are making money off of Xiaomi other than Xiaomi being employed by this company. So I think they're safe. And effectively, in terms of like, I have not seen accusations of like secret backdoors. They haven't had the same blowback globally that Huawei has. They've been pretty good so far, and I think that their position as a dominant player, it's also, it's Xiaomi and Oppo and Vivo. They seem to be spared, will maintain that lower profile. I think also their most visible faces as I recall, Xiaomi has a lot of very high-profile Indian executives. So they've been smart about localization, which Alibaba wasn't very good at. So I think they're going to be okay. At the end of the day, like Reliance, a company like Reliance needs a company like Xiaomi, actually. Reliance is a telco operator, right? It needs phones that are good and cheap. It needs phones that will let people have the specs to watch video, but are cheap enough that like not just the 5 million people in Mumbai can afford it, right? So there's a lot of reason and India as a country has a lot of reason to endorse affordable good hardware, right? It benefits everybody, anybody from like a businessman looking at a stock price to farmers who are able to hedge the cost of their cotton, right? So as long as these companies are careful and not hitting third rail of politics, they can serve the interest of the local economy and local policymakers, right? And sort of informatization and economic development. So I think they don't pose the same threat. It's not like there was a big player, as far as I know. No, I think there are some Indian companies, but I don't think they just didn't seem to gain the same traction.
Since you mentioned, Apple and China being in similar shoes, do you think that China will come down hard on US companies that are heavily invested here, like Apple or, Starbucks?
These companies get dinged all the time. Starbucks had its brouhaha a couple of years back with the Starbucks in the Forbidden City, which I think has now become like, is it a Luckin Coffee now? Probably. Apple gets dinged every once in a while. Like they had to change their warranty policy because it was sort of anti-China at one point. But I think, Apple lost market share in China, not because of anti-US sentiment, but because the Huawei phones were just really good, right? Like, Apple used to be like the Mercedes, right? It has a luxury status symbol, right? But then Huawei, became just a really, really high-end phone. So they lost market share, not because of the politics, but because of the changing consumer taste. I think more broadly speaking, when I was in China a decade ago, the shtick was that, Chinese can make products, but they don't know how to do brands. Well, that's BS, right? Like the fact is that like Chinese turns out to be, there's not like a genetic thing for branding, right? Chinese are good at brands, right? Like if you look at across the spectrum, consumer goods, there are like a lot of hot Chinese brands now, right? Was it Pop Mart that just did the IPO? I mean, this is like a gazillion-dollar company that sells tchotchkes, little whatever, like LOL
I don't
doll.
get it.
Right? But like that's pure branding, right?
That's right.
That is pure branding. And it turns out that like the Chinese are good at branding. So Huawei also did a decent job at branding, as did Vivo and Oppo, right? Again, like that's a company, like I remember when Bubble Gao was selling its VCD players and the marketing was Arnold Schwarzenegger. And now like, so he learned, right? So they'll be dinged for like, oh, you don't do this the right way. But at the end of the day, like Apple brings in, so what Apple has done is enormously beneficial for China because it didn't tap into a pre-existing supply chain. It trained a supply chain. It trained thousands of engineers. It trained thousands of highly skilled workers. And these engineers and workers didn't just, they spread out throughout. And like, so the same supply chain that makes an Apple also makes a Xiaomi. Without Apple helping foster that supply chain, you wouldn't have a Xiaomi or a Vivo or, whatever other brands are out there. I think that there's a recognition that having Apple still in China is beneficial. Again, it's aligned to the interests of China. Their market share as a product is so small that it's not really a threat. They employ, imagine what would happen to Kunshan if you shut down the Pegatron's factory there. You'd have a problem, right? Like you would have, even though Pegatron is a Taiwanese factory, the workers are all
Chinese.
Yeah. And it's like tens of thousands. These are massive operations, right? Like maybe Beijing wouldn't care, but Kunshan would lobby really hard to like, you can't shut us down, right? Because it would be like a devastating blow to not only Kunshan, but to Shanghai, because it's not just employees, it's the entire supply chain that's coming, it's hundreds of factories that contribute to these facilities. So I think, they'll continue, if they need to, they'll do like the CCTV investigative report and like, ding them. But they can't do more than that, given how important they are to domestic policy goals.
Understood and agree. And you mentioned supply chain. So, how currently the Chinese government has directed Chinese companies to be more self-reliant, and specifically in the semiconductor industry. Do you think that we're going to be seeing the decoupling of the supply chain accelerate much quicker?
That's a tough one. So the government's efforts so far to direct creation of a new semiconductor industry has been a disaster. They have poured so much money into failures, right? I believe, these companies which one defaulted recently? It's a history of defaults and shutdowns. We actually wrote about a JV with Qualcomm and one of the local governments, and it just kind of quietly was shut down until we wrote about it. Governments are not very, and this isn't a Chinese thing, but like the track record of state spending on picking winning tech is not a good one. It's not just a Chinese thing. It's just true in general. It's very hard for government bureaucrats to pick winning tech. Their exceptions would be the DARPA and some of the stuff that's happening in Israel. I am deeply skeptical of SMIC's ability to suddenly catch up to Taiwan Semiconductor. And it's interesting, we're not talking about American companies, we're talking about a Taiwanese company, right? Just so it's not the West, right? It's hard to make a fab to do these super thin technologies. Now, where you might see something happen, what governments are good at is weirdly fostering cutting edge research. So like if a government says like, okay, we're going to give grants to anybody doing quantum computing, then you can motivate, right? Somehow that seems to work. And so maybe the next, the future generations, right? China might come out ahead, but for some reason, getting a company to profitably make that technology is just really hard. I would have thought that it would be a no-brainer, but these companies just repeatedly have failed. So I am deeply skeptical of decoupling. I also think this is it's a theme I keep going back to, is that one of the unusual aspects of the China-US relationship is how intertwined they are in terms of capital and intellect. I didn't think about it at the time, but when I did my pre-med at Columbia a million years ago, the guys who were my TAs in chemistry were all Chinese. And chances are they probably end up either being professors or working in the US. Right. So these were mainlands who are now contributing to the intellectual property buildup of the US. I mean, if you go and vice versa, there's no Alibaba, there's no Tencent without Wall Street.
That's right.
And then you go to particularly like semiconductors is more of a patent driven industry, right? And so, but AI, for example, which is another sort of area of contention, it's mostly open source, meaning that you produce the research, even for private companies, they'll have like their research teams and they'll just post it online. So AlphaGo does its algorithm, it posts it online. The team from Tencent will look at that, and actually they've tweaked it and say, oh, we figured out how to improve it. They post that online, right? So it's because AI is born out of a pure research environment. So like these companies, to lure the best talent, they kind of have to keep offering them. So professors are weird, right? They don't just want money; they also want recognition,
money and fame. Just kidding.
Yeah. Well, I think in some cases they want the fame more than the money, right? Like, and so that's why these companies have all maintained. They all publish frequently. So, I mean, semiconductors, as I said, it's different, right? It's really about like you make a patent and you make a ton of money off the patent. I know people talk about decoupling. I just don't see how it could happen. even then, like, so Huawei, it's like, so like, even with all the stuff that's been going on, companies such as Intel and Qualcomm have gotten exceptions, special licenses. So it's like, yeah, you can't sell to them, except under certain conditions I mean, yes, effectively, like, I think what's killed Huawei's phone business wasn't necessarily the chips, but the software. Not having access to Google kills them overseas because that's what people want. They want a cheap Android phone that has super high specs, right?
Yep.
And it wasn't the chips that killed them, but the software, in my opinion. I'm skeptical that we'll see decoupling. And if there is decoupling, well, where does, the most important company for both sides is Taiwanese, right? So interestingly enough, they're building facilities now in the US, but I don't see them shutting down in Shanghai. So that's my wishy-washy take on it.
All right, I like that kind of approach better as well. I don't like it when I hear a very us versus them, us or them kind of rhetoric all the time. And like you said, I do think that US China are just so intertwined, just from my personal experiences of where people were educated, how they work, where they got their ideas from, etc., how the industry works, etc. Yeah, I don't really see how it could just decouple like that. And you mentioned Tencent just now. So given that Tencent owns a few major gaming companies like Epic, and with the recent lawsuit between Apple and Epic, do you think that there's a possibility that the US government might pressure Tencent to, for example, divest their holdings in the US?
If Trump would win a second term, maybe. I think Biden has other issues to worry about. I think there are real issues with, China's a red herring. Russia's the big problem, right? Like, when it comes to hacking, the Russians have done a number on the US. Like, that's like, I don't know why people are like, oh my God, TikTok. Like, what? Stupid teen videos are not the problem. Okay. Like, really, guys, like, let's focus on, like, planet Earth. Then, that said, the Chinese authorities, not, there are Chinese spies. I'm not saying all Chinese, but there's a track record there's a history of spying and hacking as well. But I don't think, and I think that needs to be addressed, but that is, like, by and large, WeChat has issues on being pressured and being used in surveillance domestically, and WeChat has become a vehicle overseas for disseminating what some would call propaganda, other would say the truth. But I don't think the games are an issue. Tencent, I don't think the Biden administration is going to be looking at the games. I think there's still going to be definitely a focus on stopping and preventing the more overt hacks. And I think some of the stuff about, like, the influence of the mechanism of Chinese influence operations is still going to be closely watched. This is sort of a broader issue you see in Australia, right? That whole thing about, like, the United Front work. The Chinese, they know how to use this is like going back to, like, the revolutionary days of, like, tapping the elites and finding, fellow travelers and all this stuff. So that stuff is real, and there will still be a focus on that. But I don't think a company I don't think video games are going to be seen as the battleground where those fights will be fought.
And that brings us to the last but the hardest question when it comes to US-China tensions, which is, how do you think the Biden administration will handle the current tension between US and China?
So as I said, like, a lot of the stuff that the Trump administration did, broadly speaking, I think the broad trend will continue, because there's a feeling of disillusionment on both. Like, I used to joke, the one thing that Democrats and Republicans agree on is that, like, things with China have to change, right? And because there's a broad feeling, even among businessmen, and it's interesting, like, some of the people who I knew who are still in China, who are among the most, like, whose lives are the most vested in China, like, this is like senior lawyers, senior businessmen, are just, like, burnt out. They're like, they're like, they feel as if, like, it's enough, right? Enough with the, like, IP theft, enough with the restrictions, enough, right? We've got to do something to, like, we have to stand up to this, right? The engagement, or for lack of it doesn't always work. And sometimes you need to, like, put a line in the sand, and, if you cross it, there are going to be consequences. Mm-hmm. I think there's definitely that disillusionment with the effectiveness of previous policy. And that's frankly because what worked under Hu Jintao and Jiang Zemin doesn't work under Xi Jinping. It's an entirely different administration and an entirely different outlook. You need to adjust accordingly. So I think the Biden administration will continue with that tougher, line on China. Where I think they will differ is in how they execute this policy. As I said, I think the China hacks will still be that's just like unacceptable from the US perspective. And that will be still a problem. I think the questions of access of one of the most vulnerable points for China into the US is Wall Street. And the new regulations on foreign listed companies having to adhere to US auditing standards, well, that's law, and I don't think it's going to be rolled back. And that passed with bipartisan support. Democrats and Republicans agree on this. And frankly, I mean, I was kind of surprised that the Chinese got this carve out. It's kind of like, but you're, welcome to America, but like, it's like if you're going to drive on my road, well, we drive on the left. Where am I living? Right, we drive on the right side, and red means stop, and green means go, and right turn on red depending on the city. Why that kind of stuff? Like where these are the standards, you need to adhere to them. And I think with the Clinton administration getting China to join the WTO was seen as like this will bring China up to our international standards, and it didn't quite work out that way, right? So I think there's probably, my guess is there's going to be a lot more efforts to re-engage the multilateral process to get China to adhere to things that it signed, such as WTO agreements, as opposed to sort of the unilateral approach that the Trump administration favored. I think that the Biden administration is going to tap into, China's its own worst enemy when it comes to diplomacy. It's shocking to me how often they just shoot themselves in their own foot. It's just like,
I know what you mean.
Like wolf diplomacy, like you're a lone wolf, guys. Like, the wolf gets hunted, right? Like it's not a good idea to be a wolf. Like Southeast Asia should be like, even Cambodia is like, well, we're not so sure. Like Malaysia, they lost Myanmar, like come on, like Vietnam, like these are all like, these should be your client states, right? And bad choice of words, but like, there's not a lot of goodwill out there, which is surprising, right? Because it's, how many countries, given the amount of, I won't go into the politics, but it is surprising, right? Like, and so there's a lot of, I think the Biden administration can tap back into that to rebuild regional alliances, which will be uncomfortable for China, but will allow less unilateral pressure. And I think once you tap, like Australia, like they are just like, it's great. Like, so I think that the shift is going to be in the strategy. I think they're going to be less wasting time on these sideshows like TikTok, and it's also going to be less of, the Trump administration. I always felt like it was like watching an episode of The Apprentice where it's like every night was like a cliffhanger. Who will be banned tomorrow? Stay tuned. Dun, dun, dun. Every right. Trump is like, I might shut it down, but then again, I might not. Ha ha ha. You're like, now for a commercial break. With Biden, I think it's going to be much more like telegraphed well in advance. We're going to have a meeting. We're going to talk about it. These are the 10 points. This is what, It's going to be boring, but it'll still be the same in that same direction. And I think less of this theatrics. Still, I think Russia is probably the bigger priority in terms of hacking, in terms of China's commercial, but Russia doesn't have anywhere the near commercial or economic impact of China. But still, I think it's going to be a challenging relationship. They also, from the flip side, China is going to feel like, why the hell should the U.S. be the one setting the international standards? That's just right. Like, why? Like, well, we got there first. Okay, well, we're here too. We want to seat at the table, and we have different ways of approaching certain things. And I think some of the Chinese approaches are perfectly valid, and it has to be they have to be included in these discussions on everything from like setting IP addresses to figuring out, sovereignty issues over the internet. It'll be the same themes, but executed in a much more boring and predictable manner, which I'm so grateful for.
It'll be a little bit easier to report on, maybe.
The TikTok saga in particular was just ridiculous. You'd be like, yeah, we got a deal. Next day, what?
Nope.
No, we don't have a deal. Like, for crying out loud. And you can just imagine like Jiang Yiming is like sitting there with like ulcer medication. Like, what's going, like his government relations people are like, I don't know. I was like we went in the room, he said he had a deal, and then he was on the plane and someone pointed out, like it was so erratic.
I'm glad that you brought up TikTok, because that is our next segment that I wanted to address. So, a lot happened, of course, in 2020. There were talks about Microsoft acquiring the TikTok US entity completely, but the eventual decision was that Oracle gets to become an investor along with Walmart for TikTok US to ensure that data resides in the US. So what are your thoughts on TikTok's current situation in the US?
So right now the ban, they're operating normally, right? Because the courts have not upheld any of the bans. And CFIUS, I think, is also kind of been delayed also by the courts. The Trump ban, I think, will fall apart, right? Because that one, the executive ban is the weakest one. The CFIUS order probably has a better legal standing. And that is more about mitigations they would have to do in order to comply with, like you said, data security. I predict that TikTok is going to go ahead with the Oracle Walmart deal under the Biden administration. So one of the problems with the TikTok Oracle deal is that also it needs Beijing's approval, right? Because it's AI. Beijing says you can't sell control of Chinese AI to a foreign entity. And so one of the funny things was watching the Oracle Walmart side publicly argue over the meaning of their deal with the TikTok side. So TikTok is saying, oh, no, however the deal is structured, we still retain control over the tech. When Trump was told, he's like, Chinese can't control this. And so Oracle and Walmart say, no, we control it because it's a consortium of like Oracle, Walmart, and investors, which means that most of it, the investors technically, like even Sequoia China technically is a US entity, whatever. It's like, my head is spinning. I assume that they're going to sort it out. So part of it, I'm sure, will be tossed out by the courts, but I think a deal still makes sense for TikTok. I mean, Oracle won't give them the political cover under a Biden administration that it gave them in a Trump administration, right? Larry Ellison was tight with Trump. He's a big fundraiser. Don't imagine there's much love between Biden and Oracle, but they're still a big American company. But the Walmart aspect is really interesting because Walmart can teach TikTok or ByteDance a lot about commerce. And it's clear that commerce is the big battlefront in China and everywhere, right? I mean, ByteDance is killing it in advertising. Once they throw the lifeless husk of Baidu onto the side of the internet highway, they're going to have to go, Alibaba's going to go for them, right? And they know that. And so the best, defense is offense. And they're already making moves into e-commerce, but e-commerce is hard. I think they want to learn from Walmart is one of the world's most successful retailers. There's a lot of, and just as Walmart wants to learn from TikTok, like how to do social without a social graph, the way TikTok does. So I think that alliance still makes sense. And my guess is that's still going to happen, even without that looming threat. I think the deal still makes a lot of sense for these three companies. Oracle might reduce its stake, is my guess, but I think Walmart and TikTok could be really interesting. It's also, just kind of like thinking out loud, Walmart through Flipkart is big in India. And you could see maybe, okay, well, we can't go into India as a wholly owned company, but maybe we go in as a joint venture where Flipkart owns a majority, or what goes into India would be the joint venture. The TikTok, Walmart joint venture goes into India. And so you have the political cover, but you're still getting access to this, the world's second biggest internet market. So I think a deal would still make a lot of sense for them.
That's a really good suggestion. Somebody needs to forward this episode to.
I'm sure they're mapping it out.
That's true. Do you think ByteDance will still be able to grow a lot, given that there's so much pushback from all the other markets? If yes, where do you think these growth markets are? Or do you think they'll have to really just turn inward domestically?
So, as I said, there's other ways they can be inventive about how they go into market. The US is an open question. India, they might be able to figure out some kind of joint venture back way into it. What's left? Latin America, they're definitely pushing into Latin America. Brazil is a substantial market. It doesn't seem to be any kind of the same level of concern there. Middle East, not the same huge numbers, but sizable markets nonetheless, some rich targets. But I definitely think that much more of the energy will be focused on shoring up the domestic market, especially because Alibaba's trapped. Alibaba failed in the US. Its attempts to build a global payments network or financial network was shot down. Ant Group is in deep trouble. I think Ant Group is going to be cut into pieces. If not, my feeling about payments in China, payments is infrastructure. It's going to be nationalized, right? They're going to be forced to sell it to Bank of China. Like that, you heard it here first. Like, there's no way. The thing is that the Chinese government understands that business is a vehicle for control. That's why the state-owned enterprises are not only important for like making stuff, but for controlling the country, right? That's why the heads of big SOEs have government ranks. And you cannot have a country where half your payments are controlled by some private company that wants to list what? Where? No. It's like, some hedge fund's going to have any kind of say over how my country operates. It's like a highway. No, not going to happen. So given that Ant Group is in turmoil and going to have to restructure, Alibaba, India gone, Southeast Asia, maybe something happening there. And we said, C's growth into $100 billion company shows that there is a lot of potential there. But I think the big target is going to be back home in China. And so ByteDance has to defend itself against Alibaba is this machine of just growth that just keeps showing insane growth numbers. And the Ant IPO is going to be record-breaking moment. And so I think they will have to focus on back home. It's really interesting is group social commerce, the Shuchu, what is it called? Neighborhood group buying, I think is how they call it. So companies like Xinsheng Youxian or who else? I mean, basically everyone's moving into it. In second, third tier cities now, there's this big push into basically online groceries, but done. It's like a mashup of Groupon and e-commerce for groceries, where you have the neighborhood Xiaomaibu has now become a pickup station. So instead of doing the last mile delivery, you just go to the Xiaomaibu and pick up your eggs and, cabbage. But the Xiaomaibu is also texting you saying, hey, we got a good discount on fresh, mushrooms. And so these companies have all become multi-billion-dollar companies, and Ali's moving into it, and JD, and Pinduoduo, and Meituan, and Didi. They're all pushing for this next layer of commerce in China, which is groceries. It's a huge market. It's got miserable margins because we're talking about baicai, right? How much money can you make off a cabbage? Yeah. But if you're selling billions of heads of cabbage, it's just the volume of it is massive. And they're pushing into relatively untapped markets of these much, much smaller cities and towns, fourth or fifth tier. I don't even know what tiers they are. Places that make Shijiazhuang look like a modern megalopolis. So there's definitely untapped markets within China still, and people are going to be fighting for that. And I think, and ByteDance has clearly shown this whole thing in China where you can't just be a vertical, you can't just do one thing, you have to become a platform. You have to do everything. Because otherwise, if you're just one thing, you're going to be beaten by the platforms. I don't know if this is some kind of Confucius or Lao Tzu principle of war. I don't know. But in the US, you could just be I'm Warby Parker, I sell glasses. And no one's oh, Google will destroy you.
It does remind me of one line from Dao De Jing, and it says, 道生一，一生二，二生三，三生万物. So from Dao, you have 1, 2, 3, and everything. So if you already, figured out the way to do business, and technically you can venture into any industry. So, there's your Lao Tzu wisdom for you.
No, but it's true, right? There's always this thing. It's if we have traffic, if we have internet traffic, then we can do anything with this internet traffic, right? That's right. Always the big thing in China is to get the traffic. And then you say, okay, we have traffic, let's sell cheese. Oh, okay. Yeah, or cabbage. Now, granted, behind selling cabbage, it turns out that it's cabbage is actually really hard to sell because groceries are fragile and they're hard to store. So behind this Xiaomaibu person sending a WeChat hey, government, 明天我们, we're going to have a hot sale on, carp. Let's say it's fish. So Chinese buy their fish alive, not frozen. So how the heck are you going to distribute fish in some fourth tier city that's going to be fresh enough to meet the exacting demands of some very angry IEs? So you need actually turns out very complicated algorithms to figure out okay, we got the fish coming into this distribution center. It needs to be sent out to these 4 places. Luckily, because we get the orders a day ahead of time, it gives us 24 hours to scramble like mad and run our machines, and the machines figure out, and then we send out this massive distribution of trucks, and the trucks go, and instead of having to go to every door like Amazon or a Fresh Direct in the US, we only have to go to these neighborhood, and then the last mile at least is taken care of. Apparently the margins are solid enough.
That reminds me of one time I went to my aunt's place in, say, third tier city, and she bought some shrimp, and they were delivered live in a bag with water. I was in shock to find a bag of live shrimp hanging on the doorknob.
Okay, so right. And that's because that's the way a Chinese consumer, I wish Americans to some extent, but So selling groceries in China, they're not going to be like a tomato. It's hard to sell a tomato, to deliver a tomato, or an egg, right? Like delivering eggs, right? It's hard. We're not talking about like cans of pasta sauce. That's fine, whatever, right? A box of cereal, right? You can take a little beating. But when your bag of live shrimp in water, that's not an easy thing. There's like cold storage, and plus, let alone the hygiene issues, right? Let's say your shrimp got some dirty water. Your company could be crushed by like a food poisoning incident. So there actually is there's some tech in like this figuring out the logistics of it and making it the most efficient as possible. There's also just a lot of like old fashioned, well, it's not that old fashioned, but just sort of like nuts and bolts distribution.
That's right. Well, I really want to talk more about Ant Financial, which you briefly touched on. First is the hardest question, which is, will Ant Financial eventually IPO, do you think?
Yeah, sure, but what's it going to be? The Sunday breaking news was that they got called in by regulators and were told to focus on payments. And they had to like follow the rules for credit collection and a few other pieces. Basically, they're being told, stop messing around with the financial products. My guess is something is going to IPO. What it is not going to be, what was their last private valuation was like 140 billion. They're going to IPO, whatever IPOs is going to be a fraction of that. I mean, they're lucky if they end up being something like a Visa or MasterCard. That's the best case scenario. Although even then, actually, MasterCard, I take it back, because MasterCard and Visa card do offer, although I'm not quite clear who carries the risk on a MasterCard, if it's the underlying issuing bank or if it's MasterCard itself. So I should hold off on making the exact analogy. But it's clear that the payments business is what's the government is saying you can do. The credit business, the business of lending out money and selling financial products, it just doesn't work. And so some people are saying like, oh, this is all of a sudden. It's like, actually, for years, the government has sort of been trying to rein in Ant and Tencent's WePay as well. Right. A couple of years ago, they created a sort of intermediary company for payments to be routed through called Wanglian. And this was a company, it was a weirdly structured company where it's owned by a consortium of state-owned banks and the tech companies. And so my guess is that looked like an ownership structure that it looked like it was just going to be deadlocked, right? Gridlocked, because there's so many conflicting interests as opposed to like just the state saying do this. But that was interesting about that is that it sort of took, for a long time, any transaction that happened within the Alipay platform was a black box to the government. So they see money going from the bank into my Alipay account. What it does inside that Alipay universe, they have no idea whether I'm buying drugs or buying socks or a jetliner. All they see is when that money comes back out. The government set up this intermediary where like every transaction has to go through this third party where they could see what the money's going for. Given the size of Alibaba and Ant, they knew real time more about the state of the economy than anybody else in the country.
Which is pretty scary.
Right. I mean, like for better or worse, right? Like they could see, like Google can see the trends of my search habit, but it didn't have that. Imagine like Amazon and Google combined. Actually, I think Ant's presence is bigger than Amazon because Amazon doesn't do the payments as well. And the Alipay stuff wasn't just for stuff that's being bought on Alibaba, remember?
That's right.
It's a big push into brick and mortar. So it really sees like every transaction. It had a view into the state of affairs in China that no one else had. How is that possibly okay to have that in private? Plus, it was in charge of your credit history, right? So it's got your FICO score. I mean, that's a huge amount of power.
I have an excellent score on Alipay Jima credit, I think 723 or something like that. And yesterday I was looking at my year-end report for Huabei, which is like, I don't know, the credit card version on Alipay. And apparently I used Huabei to pay face-to-face about 70 times in the year 2020. Not as many times as without the pandemic, but yeah, they know all of these, where I went, when I do my shopping and stuff. It's crazy.
Right. So even if it's not about you specifically, it's it's the value of the aggregated data.
So what do you think some of the implications are for the Alibaba group as a whole with this whole IPO potentially being sliced up, like you said?
So Alibaba took a hit. The share price has fallen quite dramatically. I think the share price will continue to fall for a while, and then it's going to be a bargain that you should buy because it still is a really successful e-commerce operation. And that's Unless the one caveat is that unless Jack Ma really pissed somebody off, and then all bets are off.
Right.
Right? Like that's the one thing.
And because Ant Financial did not IPO, or Ant Group didn't IPO as planned, so, that left a lot of money on the table, right, in the Hong Kong Stock Exchange. Do you think that companies that are going to IPO in the Hong Kong Stock Exchange will benefit from this delayed IPO?
Yeah, no, I've seen that happen a lot. Well, anecdotally, I've heard that, people were allocating cash for the anti-IPO, were still interested in getting exposure to other China plays. So I think we've seen some pretty solid IPOs since then, although there recently one company that didn't do so well. But overall, I think that even though if you do some analysis, like, okay, the Chinese government intervening in such a crazy manner at the last minute should make you nervous about all China private enterprise. But it seems that, and you should be taking into account anything you may invest in, you should be looking at anti-monopoly. You should look exposure to anti-monopoly now is your number one risk. But nonetheless, like you look at the performance of like electric vehicle companies soaring through the sky, right? So I think there's some truth. What I've heard anecdotally is there's some truth to that, like people wwho like literally like the mechanics of like they put money, they transfer money from their bank account to their brokerage account. And they were like, well, it's here, there's been a flood of China tech IPOs, so let's, invest in it. Longer term, though, I think there might be some investor skepticism or investor nervousness about China tech, given the vulnerability to a sometimes unpredictable regulatory regime.
Do you think this entire fiasco offers a lesson to how Chinese tech companies should conduct themselves? Or which companies do you think might run into trouble with the state, similar to what happened with Ant?
If you're big, you're in trouble. The thing that's really fascinating about Ant Group's IPO, like these guys have deep government relations teams, right?
Yep.
Jack Ma, like I can't imagine that he didn't know something was coming. People, that speech he gave, where he gave this speech in public at a bankers forum, I believe, some kind of financial forum, where he criticized China's regulators for stifling innovation. I don't think that's what triggered crackdown. I think that speech was in reaction to the crackdown. Somebody as important as Jack Ma, I don't think somebody gives him a call like, hey, Gump, like my buddy, listen, the last Politburo meeting, not so good for you. You know what I mean? Like he spends his time meeting these officials at all levels and like at every whatever, right? Like there's Jack Ma at the Shanghai mayor or the party secretary, right? They know what's going on, right? To some extent, they must have known what was coming. If they, and truly, like I have people who used to work there and they describe like that, for example, their PR machines are so powerful, right? And able to influence and control media within China. If this company that's so powerful wasn't able to head off this disaster, what does that say for anybody else, right? Like, I mean, in the US, it's too big to fail. I think it's too big. You're going to, I'm not going to say too big, you're going to fail, but they're just too big, period. Companies that look like national infrastructure need to start worrying. I've always felt that, like, I was actually just thinking about, so Tencent, WeChat is national infrastructure. It's like there's China Mobile and then there's WeChat.
That's right.
If you want to talk to somebody, you talk to them on WeChat. This is national infrastructure, and that means it has a national security implication. Interestingly, WeChat itself isn't really monetized. We've written about it as more of like a commercial concern, and that they've like, they don't want to pollute the user experience. But now I'm beginning to wonder if it's a political decision. Like, they can't be seen making money off of national infrastructure, right?
That makes sense.
If you make too much money, but so how, if the government's looking at it, what do you do with WeChat? Well, then they can say, like, we don't make any money from it. Maybe that's the defense, is like, look, it's just a service we offer for free, and we make some money off the video games. And we definitely don't have a monopoly in video games, because look at all, like, there's NetEase, NetEase. And,
NetEase, that's right.
Yeah, and new studios coming up every day, and we don't have a monopoly on making a blockbuster, right? That's just any house can come up with a great game, and we're just here to, like, maybe that's Tencent has a more defensible position. But even the neighborhood group buying companies are like being looked at for undercutting the prices of the wet markets, the fresh markets that they're competing with. Everybody has to look very closely at their vulnerability. And then the thing is, anti-monopoly in China has a different angle, right? It is about like fostering competition, but it's also about protecting social stability. So I think Pinduoduo is vulnerable. I think JD to some extent is vulnerable. I think Tencent, as we just discussed, I think if you're smaller, you're fine, right? You just can't be big. Being big is becoming risky.
Well, that sums it up pretty well. If you're big, then you better start worrying. At least a little bit. And of course, we can't not talk about the biggest event that happened in 2020, which is the COVID-19 pandemic. Which tech companies in China do you think are the major beneficiaries of the COVID-19 pandemic?
E-commerce won, right? So Ali, JD, Pinduoduo, Tencent actually did quite well. I mean, tech in general did great because people were just buying everything online, watching videos online, and doing everything online. ByteDance also did quite well. I'm trying to think if there's a specific loser. I think Ali overall did really well. They actually had some good PR and how they handled things initially. Ali, with distributing masks and kind of like marshaling its logistics network for the distribution of protective gear. They became a lifeline, like Homa became a lifeline for people, right?
That's right.
They actually had a lot of public goodwill in how they handled it. And I think what changed, working remotely didn't take off. I mean, everybody worked remotely in China as the way they did it everywhere else, but I don't think it's going to change work habits the same way as it did in the US.
Nope.
Because I think
everyone's back now into the office already.
Yeah, and I don't think they particularly enjoyed spending all that time in their apartments. Right? It's one thing to work from home if you got a backyard. It's another thing to work from home if you're in like the 30th floor of Xiaoqu, and actually you're living with grandma, and like, damn, I can't spend another moment with my in-laws.
Or if you're from like a 4th or 5th tier city, but you most of the time work in a 1st tier city, right? Like you can't just stay in the countryside forever.
Right. That's a really good point. Is that the dynamics of like, what it means to go to work. Sometimes it's not a commute. It's like a migration.
That's right. You mentioned earlier how, we all know that China has managed the pandemic much better than the US. So what do you think are some of the implications to the Chinese economy from now, especially with the various successful vaccines, like the Pfizer vaccine being approved?
Yes, China managed after the virus better in some parts because it can do things that the US can't. We won't talk about the beginning of the virus because that's a political issue. Implication. So yeah, the Chinese economy has recovered faster. Its exports are booming. Now the question is, what happens when everybody gets the vaccine? Other economies return to normal. Will China maintain, some people say that this has shifted the balance of power in favor of China and that its economy is on track to surpass the US at a much earlier date. I don't know.
I read that report too, that China will overtake the US economy to be the world's biggest by 2028.
I mean, you got 1 billion people, right? Like they're buying stuff, right? Yes, it makes sense. It should be a large economy. It has a ton of people who are getting rich. But the US has jacked up of a weird place as it is. It's very resilient and does have a lot of really driven entrepreneurs. And so I think once the US reopens, will it come roaring back? What will happen when it comes back? What's interesting as well is that the innovative vaccine came from the West, not from China, right? The RNA-based vaccine, which is sort of the step change in how vaccines operate, didn't come from China, where they're obviously brainiacs and world's leading scientists, but it was the vaccines being developed in China are using a more traditional form of basically, I think you sort of take try to create a weaker version of the vaccine as opposed to like trying to use the RNA versus the DNA of the vaccine. So even as the virus showed the profound weakness in the Western system, it also ended up showing a certain strength and resilience of it, right? In that some of the developers are like, is a classic story, right? German couple who are Turkish immigrants, I believe. So like, that's like, oh, you can't get a more like classic story of like, look, they're immigrants. Every side will find the lesson they want. It's kind of like when libertarians in America were like, see, Sweden, they didn't do any mask wearing or lockdown and they're fine. Like, yeah, Sweden also has nationalized healthcare, so if you get sick, everything's taken care of. Like, what will happen, though, for sure, is that China comes out of this thinking, like, feeling its oats, like, look at us. We survived the financial crisis in 97. We sailed through the global meltdown of 2008. We are rock stars. We are mega genius economists, right? And COVID-19, right? Look at us, right? And so, I mean, if you're sitting in Zhongnan High, you're like, bonus, you know what I mean? Like next time you meet somebody from the US, you're going to be like, tell me again, how many died?
I
Can you
can
repeat that?
assure you that is
I'm
exactly how most people feel about the entire situation in China, especially young people as well, feeling very proud
right. I
country
mean,
and their
like,
government.
you know, but remember the beginning when that poor doctor was posting, like he was gasping for breath. What's his name? Lee.
Li Wenliang.
Yeah, you know, it could have gone really bad for China. I remember I've never seen anything like it when like my
Same.
entire WeChat moment was just like anger, this profound anger. And it's been totally that narrative, partly because of very skillful manipulation, but also because like at the end of the day, like I go out and wear a mask here in Hong Kong. You in China are like having parties rubbing up on each other in public. You know, these are images that like Americans are like, wait, they're in public without masks and they're touching strangers? Oh my God, what is that like? You know?
That's right.
So now, will that lead to hubris and like a misstep? Because this virus, by the way, is a nasty critter. It's nasty, right? Beijing is back under some severe lockdown, right? This thing.
Yeah, like 19 like mid-risky regions or something now in China. Lockdowns are coming back on.
Yeah, so don't get, you know, you got to be careful with this critter. You can't get cocky. And like, let's say, I mean, heaven forbid that the vaccines don't work or that there's a screw up in like the distribution or like somewhere along the line, there's like, you know, some kind of contamination, right? These are things that happen in China, right? Like where somebody's like, oh, we'll cut a corner, right? Like this is the country that like poisoned infant formula, right? Like,
oh, let's not bring that back up. Yeah, that's so embarrassing. It's so sad.
but it was a systemic problem, right?
That's
it was
right.
the way that incentives were built. It was like people lower down on the chain who were like, you know, I need to make a buck and ignoring the consequences. And so I mean, and there's been other issues with Chinese medicine that's sold on the global markets where like somebody's trying to cut a corner. You know, somebody asked me, would you take a Chinese vaccine? And I thought, you know what? I think there's going to be so much scrutiny on the Chinese vaccines from the Chinese government, right? Because they have a lot riding on this, a lot.
That's right.
They cannot have people in Brazil dropping dead from Chinese vaccines. Right? No, you know what I mean?
I shouldn't be laughing this hard. But I totally understand. That's right. It's
yeah.
true.
So I think, but yeah, the way they turn this narrative around, and so China's going to feel awfully cocky about everything. And I wonder if that will translate into how, so it's weird. So the Chinese government's feeling very, very cocky, but the Chinese companies are feeling like they've just been beaten up wherever they go. So it's, I don't know how that plays out.
We still need to cover SoftBank and its current strategy to go private.
Yeah, SoftBank, I'm going to have less to say about. I think Masayoshi-san has been talking a lot about how the company isn't as valuable as the investments. And I think so much of their value is tied up in Alibaba. So I'll just buy Alibaba. Why would I buy SoftBank, right? If it's the sum of your parts. And then the other question is like, so SoftBank's done really, really well. Like the Vision Fund I thought was going to be disaster. The fact that they can't raise a Vision Fund 2 kind of shows that it's sort of been a mixed result. And they've gone up, you know, SoftBank has done very well because because the stock markets have gone up, not because their products have been killing it. So if I want to, like, that's a hedge fund or that's an investment bank. So then I won't buy SoftBank, I'll buy Goldman Sachs, right? I'll buy the guys who I know have a track record of investing and running money, right? I think SoftBank is they're kind of taking maybe the Warren Buffett approach where you have like one thing that makes money, like in Warren Buffett, it was the insurance industry that, you know, generates a stream of money that you can then use to invest in other things. I'm still uncomfortable. And then the take private, like I get why they're doing it. I still feel, you know, don't bet against Masayoshi-san because he bounces back no matter what, right? But for investors, if the take private is at a good price, then they'll agree to it, right? And then great, everybody walks away happy. I do think that ultimately though, the strategy of like the $100 billion investments in tech didn't really work out.
Do you think that their, you know, more enormous influence on the tech industry kind of waned off after WeWork? And where do you think they will spend the rest of the money that they have?
Oh, they spent it all already. They spent it down. Yeah, they've spent it down. They managed to blow it. I mean, not blow it, right? So the surge in the valuation of tech companies has really helped their portfolio and they can mark it up. But even then, they've had to mark down a lot. They spent a ton of money. I think they've basically, I believe they've spent it all down. And because now there's some of the newer investments are from Vision Fund 2. But Vision Fund 2 only has a couple billion from SoftBank itself. They don't have other investors on that second fund. And so
do you think they will get any more to make it a real?
I mean, no, I don't think the thesis hasn't worked out. Like, it's not just about throwing money at a problem, right? Sometimes if you give too much money to a company, especially a young tech startup, they make mistakes. Because it's like, well, we got money, and so let's buy the nail spa because we'll figure out how to monetize, or you know what I mean? Like, I mean, WeWork was such a mess. So many of their other high-profile investments haven't really worked out. I don't think they'll be able to do a second fund. That doesn't mean that SoftBank won't continue to be a major player, but no one really gets as excited about them. I think you've seen the return of Silicon Valley. Like, people are talking about, like, wow, Sequoia's returns were fantastic. Like, who are the winners? People were talking about in like DoorDash, the recent US IPOs. It's interesting. Like, SoftBank had some hits in there, but really, the winners were Silicon Valley VC firms.
I see that DoorDash's IPO gave them about a 10 billion gain that helped write off WeWork's investment. If they do go private, do you think they potentially could, maneuver a comeback after being private?
I mean, Masa used to be the richest man, then he became practically broke in the first dot-com bubble. He's gone back, the WeWork debacle was erased by the surge in their investments in the past year. But that's the thing, is like, making money in tech this year was kind of like, well, yeah, because this doesn't show me that you're a genius. It shows me that you were in tech in a year when like the spigots were open, interest rates were zero, nothing else was worth investing in. So you okay, yeah, I mean, if I had money, I would have made, if I could buy Apple and Amazon, I'd be doing well too, right? I mean, I'm sure there's more to it, and I'm being a little simplistic, but I don't know. It didn't show like, oh my God, he's a genius, and how they maneuvered. In fact, some of the more complicated trades they made became problematic. They were doing some sort of financial engineering that they ran into trouble with. It seemed to be just like, and there was the Wall Street Journal was reporting about how a lot of the trading was being run directly by Masayoshi Son. Well, like, okay, like if you're spending your day as a day trader, you're not spending your day as the CEO of a tech conglomerate, right? Like, that to me felt like you're losing focus on when I buy SoftBank stock, I wanted to do tech, not to do investing, right? I talked earlier about like, well, if you show me like, look, we're such smart investors, like, well, then I'll buy, BlackRock or Goldman Sachs or JP Morgan. But yeah, then again, like, the guy reinvents himself, and I'm sure he'll come up with the next act, and I'm very curious to see what it'll be.
I do hope 2021 is also going to be making a comeback for everyone, like how he made a comeback for himself. So now the most exciting part. What are some of your predictions for 2021? And then we can grade your, paper in a year from now.
Well, we kind of salted them throughout this interview. So I think, Ant Group, I'm going to make deliberately provocative things. So part of Ant Group will be effectively nationalized through a merger with a state-owned bank. I think TikTok will go through with, or ByteDance will go through with some kind of partnership with Qualcomm and Walmart, and that partnership will go back into India. I predict that Alibaba will have shrinking market share in China as a host of newcomers on the online grocery and other forms of e-commerce, including ByteDance, start nipping at its heels and start chipping away at its dominance. I predict that U.S.-China relations will continue to be tense, but it'll go from, as I said, this sort of TV show cliffhanger to a much more predictable and moderated policy, but still will be tense. I predict that once the vaccine is more universal, you will see the U.S. economy roar back at a surprisingly strong level, probably stronger than before, and that it will surprise the Chinese. And I think that the IPO market will actually continue to stay strong, not because of more qualitative easing, but because of the rebounding global economy. And I predict that one of the Chinese EV companies that is doing well will probably vanish. We're going to see another accounting scandal. My guess is the most likely targets for an accounting scandal would be, without being libelous, let's just be more broader. We're going to see another big accounting scandal come up.
What about for SoftBank? Any predictions?
They'll probably, I think the privatization won't happen. It's a lot of money. And then again, Japanese banks don't have much else to do with their cash, right? That's one of the secret weapons that SoftBank had, is that it has these domestic banks that are negative interest rates, right? So I can either like make no money from deposits, or I can lend it to SoftBank. And as crazy as he is, like he hit some home runs. So maybe a consortium of Japanese banks would offer the take private, but I think they'll prefer to stay public and benefit from, because staying public when tech's valuations are going up gives them more power to buy other things or to do, there's no reason for them to go private at a high price.
That's a solid list of predictions that I can't wait to revisit in a year from now. And before I let you go, do you have any recommendations for our listeners?
Oh gosh, my life has been somewhat narrow these days, but I've been listening to a lot of pop music. So
Pop music is good.
I gotta say, so yeah, Sound Opinions is where I go to for music critics. I do like Ray Ma's podcast, which I can't remember the name of it right now.
Tech Buzz China.
I've found that she does really good work, and I've enjoyed a couple of them.
Our last episode was with Ray Ma on Ant Financial.
Oh, great.
On Ant Group. That's right.
Yeah, she's sharp. She's very sharp. I met her in one of my earliest reporting trips on tech, keeping tabs on since. And she's always, because she's also very bicultural and really bilingual, just like yourself. So it's rare to have bicultural, bilingual, and like tech fluent and really understands business models. And so she can see things very clearly. I think she's a rare combination. So I really enjoyed her work. And other than that,
the information.
Yeah. Of course, you should subscribe to the information. We've had a pretty good year, I got to say. Our Asia coverage and the US, we broke the Quibi collapse, and I believe we just did a podcast with Pharrell because he's got a VC fund.
Oh, that's so cool! I wanna listen to that.
Regardless, all of our podcasts are fascinating, and we did something really interesting. It was fun. We did a TI 50, which was like a list of 50 top startups below a certain size and a certain vintage. And that was fun. In China, we stumbled into a trend, which was a lot of enterprise software and robotics and AI. So that was a neat thing to show up in that. But those are my recommendations.
How can our audience find you?
I am Smoke Signals, fax, snail mail, theinformation.com. My email is Shai, Shai, at theinformation.com. I'm on Twitter with the embarrassing handle at Beijing Scribe. If you want to say something private, ping me on Twitter. And then I got Signal. I'm on Signal and Telegram. I'm on WeChat. I don't remember my particular. I think it's Shai_Oster on WeChat. Reach out any way you can. I'm on LinkedIn. You can just Shai Oster on LinkedIn. You'll find me. I'm on Facebook.
Everywhere.
I'm out there.
That's right. And so are we. You can find Analyse Asia on all podcasting platforms. You can also reach out to us on Twitter. That is at Analyse Asia, Analyze with an S. Now, thank you so much, Shai, for doing another great year-end episode with us. I know our listeners can't see me throughout the entire episode, but I was like nodding my head and just grinning at, all the wonderful things that you were saying. I'm like, yes, agreeing to everything, but without, wanting to say that all the time. So again, thank you. And it's always a pleasure, talking to you and hearing your perspective, your take on things China and tech.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. Our job is normally to ask other people what they think, and then when we're unleashed to say what we think, it can go a little haywire.
I love it.
Pent up opinions.
Thank you so much. Here's to a great 2021. See you in the next year.
Thank you. Vaccine in hand.